Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest talk from Leeds Theosophical Society. We've been doing these now for, getting on for 3.5 years, and I think it's been a very interesting exercise. Obviously, a lot of us would prefer to be able to get together, but that's not possible all the time. So I think this way that we do it on Zoom is quite interesting. Anyway, this afternoon, what I'd like to do is to talk about karma, that law of laws, but not just so much from an individual perspective, but how it plays out collectively, because this is something that we don't talk about very much at all, about how combined karma affects everything: countries, empires, organizations, the future destiny of entire peoples. And this is a mighty and mysterious law, although the way it operates is actually quite simple. It's about the law of cause and effect. Every cause produces an effect, and every effect is produced by an originating cause. And if we understand this, and if we understand that karma is molding our current lives and our current situation, then we also understand that it gives us a certain amount of power, insofar as if our lives today have been shaped by what we did and thought and got up to in previous lives, then what we're doing right now in this life, as well as discharging the karma we've already built up, is effectively shaping our future existences on this or indeed some other planet. So if this law were more widely understood, it would effectively change human behavior quite considerably. Now, you could argue that, well, notions of karma have been entrenched in Buddhist and Hindu thought for many centuries, and it hasn't necessarily revolutionized consciousness there. But it's a question of how we understand this law and how we interpret it. And Theosophy has been tremendously useful in bringing this idea to the West, because I'm convinced that Theosophy did play a crucial role in getting this idea of incarnation, reincarnation into Western thought. If we talked about this 40, 50, 60 or 70 years ago, very, very few people would have had many notions about reincarnation or karma. Karma kind of slipped into popular consciousness during the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s. And certainly people like the Beatles and others brought it into a focus which it hadn't had before. So as far as collective karma is concerned, we'll be dealing with that in a minute, but we're seeing it played out before our very eyes. We see it played out before our very eyes every day. But at the moment, with the conflict in Israel, with Hamas, and also to a lesser extent with all the other wars that are going on in the world, and there are many of them, including the one in Ukraine, we see collective karma being played out before our eyes. And for the first time in history, we're able to watch these events unfold almost live, and in some cases live. We can see bombs exploding in Gaza. We can see rockets going into Israel as they actually happen. So we can see this collective karma unfolding before our very eyes. But as always, the cycles of history just grind on relentlessly, and hiccups and gasps, and at the moment in convulsions. And our individual lives blossom, and then they eventually perish. Trees and plant life all bloom and also vanish eventually. Animals expire and they join their cell groups on the inner planes. So every cycle and every entity is subject to individual and collective karma. Karma is the law of adjustment. And it's an unerring, universal, cosmic principle. And nothing can escape the grip of karma at some point. So this is an all-encompassing process of restoring balance and harmony, of renewing equilibrium, and perpetually shapes destinies of individuals, groups, countries, empires, etc. And karma leaves its imprint everywhere, in every hidden space of the cosmos. And there's no hiding place from this. People can say, oh, I don't believe in karma. Well, don't believe in it, but it's still there. But as I say, we often consider this very much in terms of our own personal, individual destiny. But unaware of past lives, which most of us are, it's difficult to know exactly what the causes were that are producing the effects in this life and the challenges that we now face. Some people, of course, are able to get insights into previous incarnations via various means, sometimes via flashes of inspiration or imagination, sometimes during very traumatic events, sometimes through hypnotherapy and such things. But there are numerous ways that people gain an insight, sometimes intuitively, into their past lives. But the truth is, most people are entirely unaware of where they've been before and what has shaped this present life. So you have to some extent, make a leap of faith and accept that this law does exist, even without knowing the precise mechanics of it. So trying to disentangle karma from an individual perspective is difficult enough. But trying to do it on a collective level presents us with even more problems. Even individual karma is not exactly what it seems, because not one of us, no one, operates in a vacuum. In each life, we encounter thousands of different people. We undergo many, many different interactions, conflicts, moments of pleasure and pain, triumph, extreme loss. And these all usually take place in conjunction with other people. And there's a good reason for this, and that is because humans belong to soul groups. These are collectives of individualized souls, and they're created and energized via relationships, conflicts, bonds, and karmic debts. Now, we mustn't confuse this soul group with group souls. Animals and other lesser kingdoms of nature, what we call them lesser kingdoms, but less evolved kingdoms of nature, they are subject to soul groups. What distinguishes us as human beings is that we have individualized into individual souls. Animals have yet to do this. So animals belong to large or smaller soul groups. And depending on how advanced and evolved the animal is, the smaller the soul group. So domesticated animals, dogs, cats, horses, who have a lot of interactions with human beings, will tend to have, it is believed, perhaps smaller soul groups than, say, ants or bees or something like that. Anyway, we all belong to these loose collectives of souls. And our choice of how, where, and when to be reborn may be much more heavily influenced than we realize by our obligations and connections to other souls who belong to this collective group. And it appears that individuals in these groups collectively incarnate as new personalities over and over again in varying roles and relationships. So in one life, you're my brother. In the next, I'm your friend or father or sister or mother, or indeed, arch enemy. Now, over the last 50, 60 years, there's been a lot of work done into past life regressions. And indeed, I've been through some of these sessions myself. How useful they are, I'll leave it for you to decide yourself. But One of the things that's emerged from all these past life regression sessions indicates that our own fate is intimately bound up with that of others. And people, when they remember past lives, talk about obligations to other people and how their choice of where and when to reincarnate is made in conjunction with other people that they have to interact with in order to work out some kind of karmic script or karmic debt. So it's not just about our own particular needs, it's about the needs of that collective group of souls. And so this is going to impact not just upon the circumstances of our lives, because we undertake some kind of what's called soul contract, which is the life purposes, the key missions and the vital challenges agreed with our souls prior to rebirth. And of course, all this is moderated by karma. And since all our karma is so enmeshed and entwined with that of other people, unraveling this complex group relationship and all its dynamics is almost impossible unless you're fortunate enough to have achieved adept status, which I presume most of us haven't at this stage. Let's remind ourselves of what karma is. It comes in basically three different varieties. Firstly, there's the karma that we built up in previous lives that we're now experiencing and hopefully discharging and creating a new balance. Secondly, there's that individual residual karma from past incarnations, which is still to be activated. We're often told that the soul doesn't necessarily impose these things, that we don't have karma which we cannot deal with. It's not there to kill us or crush us. So often it is delayed until a time when we can deal with it in a more mature and intelligent way. And then the third kind of karma is the karma that we're building up in this life, which will have its effects and its repercussions in our next life or our next lives. I mean, it may be 2 or 3 lives before we're actually in a position to deal with a particular issue. So karma is there to test us, and indeed it may drive us to the very margins of our endurance, but it's not there to kill us. You know, that would be a somewhat counterproductive thing. But often karma appears to us as fairly crude outbursts of reward, or more often retribution for past actions. But karma doesn't actually punish, and nor does it really offer privilege. It gives us what our souls actually require to evolve, and not, and I repeat, not what our lower personalities happen to desire, because the needs and the desires of our higher selves and lower selves are frequently at war with each other. They're frequently reading from a very, very different agenda. So the aspirations of the soul and the temporary personality are often in this stage of deep conflict. And one of the things we have to try and do is to reconcile these things within us. People often speak of good karma and bad karma, but there's really no such thing. It doesn't really fall into these two categories. There's just the law of karma itself. Karma isn't dualistic the way that we tend to perceive everything, but we are fairly dualistic people. So it's complex to understand when we take this reward and punishment element out of it. It is there purely to harmonize and to right wrongs, not to reward or to punish as such, although it may appear that way. So it doesn't dish out bad karma for Mrs. A, and it doesn't offer power and position to Mr. B, some kind of karmic gratuity. That's just a very, very crude way of looking at it. It's a single dynamic operating in infinitely different ways. And it gives us essentially what we need for each life, whether we like that or not. It is there as a vital supplier of the things that we need in order to evolve as much as possible in an individual life. And alongside consciousness itself, karma is our most essential and vital evolutionary tool. So beyond individuals and beyond the soul groups to which we all belong as individualized souls, we therefore create a kind of a collective consciousness. We have individualized consciousness, which is blended together, which means that we have all sorts of complicated networks. And these actually then go on to shape much wider collectives, whether these are nations, or whether these are organizations, whether these are individual cities. I mean, we could take an organization like the Theosophical Society, and that has two things. It has its own life cycle, and it also has its own collective karma. Each lodge perhaps has its own karma. Each country section has its own karma. The international organization itself has its own karma. The Theosophical Society, I'll remind you, is coming up for its 150th anniversary in 2025. So it's almost as if it has worked through a particular cycle, and we can see the various influences on it. We can't disentangle exactly what that karma is, but nevertheless, it's there. And it's very evident that civilizations and empires and nations are influenced very much by their collective karma. This morning I was trying to find a copy of The Ocean of Theosophy by William Judge. I couldn't find it, but either in that book or in one of his other writings, he talks about this, and it's something that's not really talked about to any great degree, this idea of collective karma. And he talks about how nations rise and reach a peak, and then beyond that, they can go no further, and an inevitable process of decline starts to set in. So the most advanced egos, the most advanced souls, don't want to incarnate in that particular family or kingdom or part of the world at that time, because something better is emerging somewhere else. And therefore, when the less advanced egos stop incarnating in these particular countries or empires or civilizations, they inevitably go into decline. So the collective karma of the world can be considered. Imagine how difficult that would be, given that there have been billions of people living on this planet, and the collective karma is a soup of all those karmas mixed together. And so, since consciousness produces karma, collective consciousness produces collective karma. Now, when we examine the rise and fall of all civilizations, or the emergence and decline of individual countries and nations, or even the extinction of entire people, two facts become extremely clear. The first is the inevitability of cycles, and this is something I'm absolutely fascinated by, and something I've written about quite extensively. The second is the overarching imprint of karma. So cycles and karma are locked in this kind of permanent embrace, and what you might call an eternal dance of some kind. Now, over the last 150 years, archaeology has gone through many, many developments, and huge discoveries have been made of lost civilizations, and some of the oldest structures have survived the tests of time, while others have just crumbled away. And when we look at the history of the world and the rhythms of history, it's the same story everywhere. It's invading armies, it's mass migrations, famines, plagues, or climatic or geological changes in the world. And many of these high points in humanity are still remembered as mighty and prominent achievements. But none of these civilizations has survived more than a few hundred years. And it's their karma which dictates the length of that life cycle. We think of Egyptian civilization lasting for perhaps 3,000 years, but it went through numerous metamorphoses during this time. Egypt was invaded 18 or 20 times during those 30 centuries. And so the Egypt of the early period was nothing like the Egypt of the later period. And despite its lasting legacy as a core building block of Western civilization, we look at ancient Greece, which we still revere. I certainly do. It gave us an appreciation of beauty, democracy, music, mathematics, art, sport. But again, it reached a high point, it reached a number of high points, and then followed by periods of decline. And what always happens, there's usually either an invasion or some kind of internal descent, or sometimes both. And every civilization goes through this same process. Greece, of course, more recently, spent 400 years trying to rid itself of its own invaders, the Ottomans. And finally, in 1821, I believe, they were able to throw out the Turks and gain independence as a nation once again. The point I'm making here is that nations decline and then ascend again sometimes in very, very different forms. But the point we need to make is that nothing at all lasts for very long, and permanence is really just an absolute illusion. The Roman Empire, which of course was vast, superseded the Greeks to some extent, but exactly the same thing happened to it after a few hundred years. I mean, it was a vast enterprise spanning much of Europe and beyond. But it's an all too familiar pattern. They were a once triumphal and very acquisitive and highly militarized civilization, but over time, they decay into decadence and into debauchery and into irreversible decay. Then, of course, the Roman Empire becomes something else. It changes into something else. It becomes the Holy Roman Empire, and then more latterly, it turns into the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church actually bears a lot of the hallmarks of the Roman Empire. It's been responsible for its own persecution and conquests which devastate landscapes and raze cities and eradicate people. We saw how they did this in South America and Central America especially. And the Catholic Church has become equally acquisitive and as dogmatic and in its own way, as militarized as the Roman Empire was before it. So all these conquests and all these world events, even natural disasters, are all the agents of change, but they're always driven by some kind of karmic necessity. And when you look at all the civilizations that we talk about, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Celts, and long before that, even the Atlantean civilization, which seems to be a case in point. If we believe much of what we've studied about Atlantis, we know that that society reached a very, very high point and had world influence. But then over a period of time, it too decayed. various land masses disappeared until it became a group of islands, until finally it was just a single island. Long before that, many of the Atlanteans had escaped to other parts of the world. And we know they went to South America, to North Africa, to Europe, and possibly to Asia as well. So they, to an extent, knew what was coming. It's often said that the Atlanteans brought about their own downfall because the society divided itself into two distinct groups, those pursuing the path of white magic, beneficent magic, which benefits the collective, and those pursuing much more sinister agendas, the lords of the dark face, as they're sometimes called, who tried to manipulate the forces of nature, who tried to be very, very acquisitive in terms of their personal goals. And you can see, if this is to be believed, you can see haunting parallels between what was happening in Atlantis 12,000, 14,000 years ago and what is happening to our planet right now. So this society reached a point, as the Lemurian society had reached a point before it, but then it all collapses. And Madame Blavatsky and others tell us that, these places are destroyed alternatively by fire and by water. What our current civilization will be destroyed by, I've no idea. But they all succumb to this inevitable decline and also to the inpouring of new energies. And every ancient culture spanning millennia eventually gives way to some new external influence. Australia is an interesting point. They've just voted not to allow this Aboriginal rights bill, which strikes me as being somewhat curious. But when the white man first went to Australia in the late 18th century, there were around about 1,000 different tribes of Aboriginal peoples, numbering possibly 1 million people. And they'd been there untouched, unaffected by any other civilization for a period of 60 or 70,000 years. But in a few decades, they became marginalized and almost like persecuted strangers in their own land. So this is a very interesting point. I mean, the Aboriginal civilization has lasted far longer than any other that we know that was supposedly more advanced. But then the Aboriginal peoples have probably been the best at living in close contact and harmony with the world and with nature than many others, and certainly our own at the moment. So allegiances are always shuffled, political, military allegiances, economic allegiances, and centers of power shift over time. Commentators such as Alice Bailey and also the contemporary esoteric astrologer Philip Lindsay point out that what was a very dark vortex of evil, which had overshadowed Nazi Germany, relocated to the United States after World War II. Now, if you accept this as an idea, I'm open-minded about this, I don't know whether it's true or not, but if it is true, it's interesting to consider what karmic imperative lies behind that particular development. And it certainly was happening. When President Eisenhower gave his closing speech as president in early 1961, he warned then of the dangers of what he termed the military-industrial complex. And what he said has proved to be absolutely true over the intervening 62 years. This country that we live in, the UK, Britain, we once had the biggest empire that the world has ever seen, and it covered around 40% of the globe. When I was young and I used to look at those school atlases of the world, they always had the British bits in pink, and you'd look at a map of the world and see all these pink bits on it, Australia, Canada, huge bits of Africa, Asia, and everything. But at that point in the 1950s, we'd lost any sense of empire. The empire had been lost by then, and it had become rebranded as something else, which is the Commonwealth of Nations, which obviously still exists today. A lot of people argue, some historians argue, that there has been effectively a managed decline of Britain. And I think this is an interesting idea to explore. Britain, of course, remains one of the richest and most influential nations on earth, one of the most innovative, despite having less than 1% of the world's population. When we look at the British Empire, it didn't really last that long at all. It lasted a little under 400 years. And it started with various merchant adventurers crossing newly charted oceans to occupy exotic new territories in the 16th century under the reign of Elizabeth I. And then throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, this empire thrived. I mean, it did all sorts of wonderful things, and it did some pretty bad things as well. It enslaved and it plundered, it civilized, it united, and it reshaped the world. If you look back on these things, I would date the actual high point of the British Empire as coming in the Edwardian era, the period 1901 to 1911. And the first stirring of the decline of that empire came in August 1914, when the First World War erupted, and everyone was locked in this 4.5-year blood-drenched, mud-soaked stalemate for a lot of it across the world, but particularly in France and Belgium. And most of the nations afterwards were just left exhausted and financially wounded, and above all that, psychologically drained. And it also created new political vacuums into which more extreme things like communism and fascism could survive and thrive. And briefly, Britain's empire actually expanded because we acquired some of the territories that Germany was forced to give up during the Versailles Treaty. But then we had the Great Depression, which affected Britain and most other countries in the world. And then we saw this shadow appearing over Europe as the Nazis appeared and got to power in Germany. But the first really serious nail in Britain's coffin came on the 3rd of September, 1939, on that Sunday morning, when Neville Chamberlain announced that because of the invasion of Poland, Britain was at war with Germany. When that conflict ended 5.5 years later, in May 1945, Britain, although it had won that war, had actually been one of the chief losers of it, because it was a battered nation. It was broke. It was bankrupted by the war. It had debts which were only paid off a few years ago. So that victory, in a strange sort of ironic way, had sealed its future decline. And wars inevitably act as catalysts for ascendancy, or indeed for collapse, and sometimes, in the case of Britain, perhaps for both. Because Britain, after that, could no longer afford to maintain its colonies. It couldn't afford a large army. And so it had to divest itself of this empire and grant independence, as it did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to many countries which it formerly governed. And so, alongside all this international streamlining, there came core internal changes. The demographics of this country changed. Its industrial base changed. All its traditional industries went. In a supreme act of self-harm back in the early 1960s, we had this fantastic railway network, but we said we can't afford that anymore. So we brought in this man, Dr. Richard Beeching, to axe 2/3 of it in what was probably one of the most short-sighted moves. So Britain, although it's been at this point of ascendancy and it's declined, it is now in the process of redefining who it is. And it's not unique in this. I'm just talking about Britain as being a place I know a little bit about. And what we can see, we can visibly see that we, during that period of empire, created very strong karmic bonds with other nations, with other cultures, and with other peoples around the world. And some of those bonds were very, very intimate, especially from the Indian subcontinent. Of course, India was always regarded as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and our roots there go back a long way. Those roots started, of course, purely as commercial and not as political or military or anything like that. But we have a close bond now, particularly with India, but with other places too, with the West Indies, with Africa and numerous other places. And of course, we have bonds with the United States, with Canada, with South Africa, Australia, New Zealand as well. So we will eventually evolve into something else. But what we have achieved and our failings and our successes have all been shaped by this karmic process. And this karmic process often works very, very rapidly. There are many cases where civilizations reach some kind of acme, some kind of supreme point, and then collapse very quickly and very suddenly. When they discovered Machu Picchu in Peru, archaeologists discovered that this place had been abandoned perhaps almost overnight. And there are countless stories of other places, other cities, which were suddenly abandoned. We don't know the reasons for them. Was it war? Was it plague? Was it climate change? Was it a sudden lack in food or water supplies? Or was it a combination of all these things? But these things can happen very, very quickly indeed. And we need to be aware of the fact that the karmic process doesn't always lead to a long period of decline. That decline can come very, very savagely. And we also need to realize that when we look at a map of Europe today, you know, a lot of the places that we regard as long-standing countries, you know, weren't at all. Italy only became one country in the 1850s. Germany only became one united country under Bismarck in the 1870s. Before that, it had been a series of principalities and city-states and various other things. And it was only brought together as one entity at that point. So all these things are shifting constantly. And we live in a world now where the change that we've come to experience seems to happen on an almost permanent basis. I mean, no doubt the reason for this is that, as I said earlier on, we're able to see things almost now in real time as they unfold. But we should also be aware that every conflict which unfolds also holds within it the seeds of future conflicts. And this is one of the problems that humanity has yet to face, how it deals with conflicts which inevitably are going to arise amongst peoples and cultures and religions. How do we deal with this without resorting to arms? Because we've reached a point now where our weaponry is so sophisticated and we have the power to destroy the very planet that we live on, even if not, or to despoil it to the point where life can no longer survive on it. Humanity has reached a tipping point. And if only more people understood that their actions, their thoughts, their intentions, and even their emotions are shaping the world around them, if only more people were a little bit more aware of this, the world could change much more rapidly than people realize. But until and unless people start understanding this law of karma and start understanding it in a more realistic way, i.e. not just as a weapon of punishment or as a gift from the gods, when people start looking on it not in a literal way, but as a kind of general dynamic which rules every aspect of life on Earth. When people start to do that, we can begin to transform the world. Because the destiny of peoples, the destiny of civilizations, our own personal destiny, is not some sort of haphazard, random chance accident. Everything happens because of a cause, whether we know what that cause is or not. So our own responsibility is not really just our own responsibility. It's part of a wider collective responsibility that we have. And the more of us who can exercise that collective responsibility, the more we can do our own little bit to shape the world and to shape a better destiny for humanity. Because as we've seen, everything is so temporary. If we'd been around in Europe when the Huns and the Visigoths and the Vandals were running riot, or any of the other marauding armies, we would have seen things just from that perspective then. We couldn't have foreseen how these events, when morphed through other events, become the tides of history and cause immense change to individuals and to countries. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'd be very interested to hear any of your thoughts or comments on this, because I do think it's a very, very interesting subject. And I think this idea of collective karma, although it's almost impossible to unravel, it is something that's worthwhile considering. So if any of you have got any comments, perhaps if you go into the reaction box and raise your hands. Thank you.